Welcome, today's story is full of drama. Like and subscribe to stay updated. Let's get started.
The sun was rising as I sat gazing down the valley to the east. The rancher who had sold me the land had named it Serene Valley, though it had been far from serene for him, and it certainly didn't seem serene to me after a restless night of fitful sleep. I often found myself here in the early morning questioning if I had made the right choice. This was a self-imposed exile, a decision I had made for myself. I now lived in a small stone house that I had built when I first arrived. I earned the property by tending to an older man until he passed. As I constructed the house, he watched me, telling stories of his life here. I made the walls sturdy using clay from a nearby creek to seal the gaps. The only wooden parts were the rough-hewn rafters and the joists for the floor and loft. I purchased boards for the roof and crafted the shakes myself. Beside the house was a lean-to sheltering my two animals, now my only companions, my large bay gelding and an older mare that I used as a pack animal. Feed for them was abundant, thanks to a spring just below my dwelling. This morning, my restlessness felt stronger than usual. Perhaps it was the loneliness. It had been nearly 4 months since I last saw another person. I had arrived here 25 months ago after taking a life. I had killed before, as that was my line of work. I had ended the lives of 3 men, each one justifiable, for I wore a badge. The last kill, though, troubled me. It too had been legal, I supposed. A stagecoach had been robbed twice at a specific point, and it was expected to happen again, as the previous 2 robberies had been successful and trouble-free for the man behind them. I was sitting, thinking back to how things happened 3 years ago. At that time, I was riding the stage, waiting for it to be robbed again. The bandit had never been seen or identified. There was always a warning shot fired from concealment high up in the rocks and a command to throw the mail sacks down. As soon as the sacks hit the ground, the coach was directed to continue on. The mail sacks were opened, and the letters rifled through and left behind, with all the money taken. Whoever was doing this couldn't have been getting very rich, but it was a crime. The shot came in the same location and from the same place. I slipped out the opposite door of the stage, waiting for my chance. I eased around back the minute the mail sacks were thrown down as directed. I ran for the shelter of the rocks. I knew I couldn't be seen. I doubted the bandit would even know he was in trouble. When the stage left, I could hear the thief coming down off the ledge. He never suspected I was there, pressed against the rocks as I was. The bandit still had a scarf over his chin and a big hat on. A small man, his gun was still in his right hand, and just as he bent to grab a sack with his left, I spoke, "Drop your gun. You're covered." There was no hesitation. He fired across his body in my direction, the slug hitting the rock to my right and spattering me with rock chips. I automatically fired in defense. He dropped right there. I stood shaking my head in disbelief. Christ, I didn't want to kill the damned fool. He wouldn't have gotten more than 2 years in Rockwood Prison. I knew he was dead from the way he thrashed around and then lay still. I eased up to him, knowing he was dead but still wary. The hat had come off and the bandana had come loose as well. I was immediately sick, for it was a kid that I looked at, maybe 16 or 17. I looked for the bandit's horse but didn't find it. How he had gotten here I didn't know. The buckboard I always arranged to follow the stage came up a few minutes later. Eric and I loaded the body onto the wagon along with the 2 mail sacks and headed for town. The sheriff was waiting for us when we came down the street to our office. The townspeople gathered behind us as we moved along, making quite a crowd before we got there. The sheriff was the first to say something. "Got him, did you, Caleb? Good job." Stupid kid didn't listen and fired at me the minute I told him to drop his gun. I fired and killed him to protect myself. Does anyone know him? He must be from around here. He looks like the Johnson kid from over by Willow Creek. Johnson died from snakebite a couple of months ago. He's got an older sister. They've been having it rough. Pity for the girl. I wonder what will happen to her. Came from one of the men standing by the buckboard. Give me directions. I'll have to go tell her what happened. It's a chore that holds no joy for me. Take the body over to Doc Hammond's, and I'll find out what his family wants to do about a funeral. The sheriff took me over to the saloon and bought me a drink. People ain't going to like you killing someone as young as that, even for cause. I may have to ask you for your deputy's badge. Here, take it, Roy. No, not yet. You better have it on when you tell his people. That'll show them it was the law killed him, not you personally. Same difference, ain't it? He's just as dead, I guess. but it might help just a little. I went across the flat and rolling valley to where some small ranches and homesteads were settled up against the range of hills. There were 2 large ranches that held the open land I had to cross. Here and there I could see men working cattle, but I didn't stop to talk. This was something I wanted to get over with as soon as possible and liked none of it. I rode into the yard and shouted, "Anyone home? What do you want, mister?" Came a voice from the shack's doorway. The only thing I could see was what appeared to be the barrel of a shotgun. "I'm Deputy Caleb Miles. I want to talk to you." I was still on my mount. "Speak up then. What's your name? And do you have a brother?" "Lila Johnson." "Yes, I have a brother. His name is Isaac." "What about him?" There was silence while I waited. "Who killed him?" "The law killed him." "You're wearing a badge. Was it you?" "It was me. He didn't give me a chance. He was shooting at me. Anyway, the body is in town. Will you be in to claim it? You can ask the sheriff for the details." "No, I won't claim him. Put him in the town graveyard." "You killed him. You bury him. Don't you want to make sure he is your brother? You should at least identify him. In fact, I insist on it. What are you going to do if I don't? Are you going to shoot me too?" I ignored that. "Will you at least come out where I can see you?" "You won't be seeing much." The woman stepped out. She had on bib overalls and a faded chambray shirt. Her shoes must have been her father's, for they were way too big for her. The only thing neat about her was her hair. Chestnut brown, it looked like it had been brushed. Curled around her face so I couldn't tell clearly what her features were. "Where's his horse?" "I can't go into town without a horse." "I didn't find a horse at the robbery." "Did you know he was robbing stages?" This would have been the 3rd time it was held up. "I suppose I knew. He came home a couple of times with a few dollars. He wasn't too bright, but we had to eat since Pa died." "Are you going to take me to jail?" "No, but you will have to go in with me. I'll borrow a horse from one of the ranches for you to ride. I'll be back for you in an hour." I headed out for the nearest ranch. I borrowed a buckboard and a driving horse. The rancher agreed to send one of his cowboys to look for the thief's horse. The boy must have hidden it and walked a distance to the robbery site. The woman saw me coming with the buckboard. She disappeared into the shack, and by the time I arrived, she was coming down the steps. She had on a faded dress. This was a girl, not a woman yet. "How old are you?" 18. I read defiance and hate on her face. It bothered me, but when I remembered I had killed her brother just a few hours ago, I wasn't that surprised at her attitude. I tied my horse to the tailgate. It was a silent journey into town. I didn't even know how to say I was sorry, and I was sure she didn't want to discuss what happened. Not with me anyhow. Arriving in front of the doctor's office, I tied the horse to the hitching post and turned to help her down. She was down and looking at me, waiting to see what was next. "We'll go into the office and speak to Doc Hammond, who has charge of the body. While you're talking to him, I'll tell the sheriff you're in town." Lila was trembling, near tears. I continued, "I'll ask Mrs. Hammond to be with you." I knew I had to say something. "Miss Johnson, I know it won't help, but I am truly sorry this has happened." Anger and hate replaced the tears in her eyes. "I'll just bet you are. When are you going to be filing my brother's notch on your gun?" I just shook my head, knowing I would never change this girl's mind about me. I went in, found the doctor, and went around back to his quarters. I asked Mrs. Hammond to go in and be with the girl for support in this troubled time. I found the sheriff and told him I had brought Lila Johnson into town. I then went into the saloon and ordered a drink, carrying it to a table. Everyone left me alone as they could see I didn't want company. As darkness fell, it matched my mood. I went across the street to my room at the boarding house. As I was going up the stairs, I came face to face with Miss Johnson. "Caleb Miles, someday I'm going to kill you, just like you killed my brother. I don't know how or when, but you can count on it." She brushed by me and went into the last room down the hall. I was busy in the morning. There was a coroner's inquest, and it was declared a justifiable shooting. Although regrettable, it was determined that the robber was killed in the commission of a crime when he resisted arrest. He had been killed by the law. Lila glared at me from across the room. She was only asked to identify her brother and state his name for the record. The inquest lasted 12 minutes, which was just long enough for me to tell my story. My reputation was such that I was believed without reservation. When I reached the boarding house for dinner, there was a chestnut mare tied to the hitching rail. I swung around and went to the sheriff's office to hear what my boss had to say. Lila Johnson is now an orphan. She has no money, and the shack she and her brother were living in is on land claimed by the nearest ranch. So, what's going to happen to her, Caleb? I don't know. Some man will come along and sweet-talk her. Maybe he'll marry her, or maybe he won't bother. I think the girl is smart enough, but she's a long way from being educated. You can't do anything for her. She positively hates your guts. I know. How did she get along with Mrs. Hammond? Good. Especially when Doc and Mrs. Hammond got her a room at the boarding house. Sheriff, I'm taking off my badge. That way, if she kills me, the law won't be as harsh on her. Did she make threats? We could hold her on some kind of charge if she did. No, I was just going by the look in her eyes. Anyway, I'll be leaving shortly after the funeral. I'm giving up the law for a while. It has been good working for you. You are a good sheriff. I turned and went out and across to Doc Hammond's office. Mrs. Hammond and I were closeted for 2 hours. That was at 1 p.m., and from then until 5 p.m., I was at the telegraph office sending and receiving messages. This killing really got to me. I knew the prospect for Miss Johnson to have a life wasn't very good. If she didn't take up with the right person, she would end up in some saloon and then probably down in a back alley somewhere. I would feel worse about that than the killing of her brother. I had saved a few dollars, and now I used some of them. Just before I left, Mrs. Hammond said, "You know, Lila isn't going to forgive you, no matter what you do." I know, but I destroyed one young life. Maybe I can help save another. She won't know, and I wouldn't want her to either. I was at the funeral, but I stood far back with the curious onlookers. I was across the street when the livery stable owner came to the door of the boarding house and offered Lila $20 for her $10 horse. A day later, I was watching from the door of the stage office when she was handed into the stage heading east. Clothes had been found for her to travel in, and I knew she had $120 in her purse. It also held her ticket, paid all the way to Kansas City. She was heading to my sister, Clara, and her husband, a doctor. A sense of relief washed over me as the stage made the turn at the end of the street and disappeared, leaving the settling dust. I could go on with my life now. There would always be that regret for the pain I had caused by killing someone. I was touched by the grief I had caused this young woman. I hoped what I had done would relieve it somewhat. I wanted to be free of all thoughts of her. But wants and what happens are sometimes far apart. 2 years later, I still thought about the girl. I had a ranch now, and it had come to me fairly easily. I had come upon an old rancher when I left town and headed west after watching Lila take the stage. It was 50 miles back to where I had been a deputy. The old rancher, Dan Walker, had been rustled down to his last horse, and that was gone too. He was old, disappointed with life, and on his last legs. It was mostly loneliness, I suspect. Anyway, he said if I'd take care of him, he'd give me title to his land. It was a full section, and he owned it outright. When I got sick of Dan's tales about coming west and all that had beset him to bring him to this pass, I would go up in the hills and prospect for gold. These hills had been prospected extensively in the past, and some gold had been found. There were diggings all over the hillsides. While the old man lived, which he did for almost a year, I looked around the ranch in the valley. The land back of it controlled good graze for stock both here and in the rough country back in the hills. No big meadows, but if someone had cattle and spread them around in the pockets of grass, he could run quite a few. The problem was I had no money to start a herd. That changed one day sometime after old Dan died. I was caught out in the hills prospecting when a fast-moving storm came down on me. I had crawled up under a ledge high up in a ravine, leaving me covered except for my boots, which stuck out in the rain. The water went rushing by just outside the hole where I had found shelter. The storm was soon over. When I crawled out, I noticed a flat rock that had been uncovered along the bottom edge of the ravine. Something glinted like copper. I picked it up, and a shock went through me. It looked like a gold nugget. I stared at it, turning it around and around in my fingers. It was kind of irregular and made me think of a walnut meat with sharp edges. 2 feet farther down the ravine, I spotted another. I searched and found one more, smaller, about the size of a pea. I pondered, how did the nuggets get here? If it was gold, where did it come from? I crawled up the ravine, now drying in the sun. Near the ridge, I could see where an outcropping of a ledge had been worked over by some miner in times past. I figured that at one time the ledge must have harbored a vein of gold. the vein now mined out. I came back and sat down near where I had crawled out of the rain. Was there anything under that slab of rock? The stone was about 5 feet long and 3 feet wide. The edges were clearly defined, and I could see where the water had run under it. It looked to be between 1 and 2 inches thick. Grasping one of the long edges, I struggled to lift it and tip it over. I got it up about a foot before my grip slipped. I set it down with a bang. Another nugget squished up near the bottom edge of the stone. Excited now, I tried lifting again. I felt like Atlas and could lift the world. I flipped it completely over and out of the way. Nestled in the silt and mud, I could see several beautiful little golden buggers all gathered in a pocket along where the bottom edge of the flat rock had lain. If this was gold, and I firmly believed it was, there was my herd of cattle, horses, and money enough to hire some help. A week later, I sat looking down the valley. I missed old Dan and wished him back. I could have made it the Serene Valley he named it. He died a year too soon. I'd have bought him cattle to restock his ranch, and we would have worked it and been happy. There was still that uneasy feeling I had this morning. I guessed I was reminiscing in my mind when I became aware that I was seeing a rider coming up the valley. Company was coming. I put the coffee pot on. When the man got here, he said he was from the livery stable and the sheriff had sent him out. He had letters from various people. There were 3 from my sister in Kansas City, 1 from the sheriff, and 2 from Mrs. Hammond. I almost immediately guessed what information was contained in the letters before I opened any of them. Henry, the liveryman, was talking about the new schoolteacher who had arrived from the east 2 days previously. He went on to describe her, saying she was 22 years old and a likely-looking thing. The town fathers were holding a dance on Saturday for everyone to become acquainted with her. She would be teaching the younger children in a separate schoolhouse from the older students. Henry asked if I would be coming into town for the dance. Yes, of course. I'd like to meet the schoolteacher. What's her name? Lila Johnson. Her brother was killed out here a couple of years ago during a holdup. One of the sheriff's deputies did it. That was before my time. People wonder why she came back to where it must be awfully painful for her. I know where her brother's grave is, too. The sheriff pays someone to keep the marker varnished and the grave clear. Says the money comes in the mail for upkeep of the grave. Foolishness, I say. When you're dead, and you don't know if weeds are growing over you or not. Well, I have to be heading back if I want to get in before dark. God, how can you live out here all alone? I got to have people around me to survive. See you at the dance. After Henry disappeared across the valley, I opened my sister's latest letter. I would read the earlier one some other time. Caleb, Lila is coming back to your town. She said she made someone a promise one time and needs to resolve it before she can move on with her life. She has never said much about her previous life before you sent her to me. I think she has mellowed some since I have known her. She was so filled with hate when she first moved in. You never told me why you sent her here. It must have cost you a bundle. Sam has her helping him in the surgery and is going to hate to see her leave when school starts. I think if you hadn't paid for her teaching lessons, she would have made a great nurse. Let me know all about her when you can. She has been as close a sister to me as can be. The kids are going to miss her more than Sam and I do. Someday maybe we can see each other again. Love, your sister, Clara. P.S. Sam and the kids send love as well. Mrs. Hammond's letter was much the same. Lila keeps asking if I know where that deputy who killed her brother is located. I couldn't lie totally. I said you came into town occasionally for supplies, but I didn't know exactly where you lived. It doesn't seem possible that she can still hate you after all this time. I think you should let me tell her how much she owes you. There is going to be a box social Saturday with a dance afterward. I'm going to put the lunch in the box I usually use. It is plain, but you must remember which one it is. You bid on it. She can't kill you in front of everyone. I'm working on her by telling her about how you gave up your badge so you wouldn't have to shoot any more bad men. The sheriff's letter was in the same vein. Caleb, that Johnson gal is back and looking for you. She is insisting that I tell her where your place is. This is just a warning. I have no idea what is in her mind at all. Be careful. Sheriff Roy. I made it to the boarding house before all the rooms were filled for the dance. I went over to visit with Mrs. Hammond. Doc is in setting a broken leg, and Lila is helping him. I wish she would be his nurse all the time. She is staying here with us, you know. This is her lunch that is going into the box for the social. I wish you two were friends. Won't you let me tell her about you? No, Mrs. Hammond. If I want her to know, I'll tell her when I see her at the dance, that is, if she doesn't shoot me first. Save me a waltz, will you? I went over to the saloon and bought a beer. I nursed it until I decided maybe I should get cleaned up. The barber gave me the works, and the tailor brushed my jacket after steaming the wrinkles out of it. People were heading for the social being held in the church. I saw Lila with Doc and Mrs. Hammond. I hung back and was almost the last one in before the doors were closed. The bidding went on in the hall, and then everyone went out back to where tables had been set up. More chickens were killed to fill the boxes and baskets for these doings than at any other time of the year. The bidding was fast and furious. Sometimes a man was elated and sometimes crushed when the box he had bid on turned out to be brought by someone he didn't know. Once in a while, the bids were run up for a lunch if it was suspected to have been put together by a pretty girl. No one was aware which lunch belonged to Lila, and I bid on it at the average price of $1.50. Her face flushed when she saw who she was to eat with and turned to look at Mrs. Hammond, knowing she had been set up. Don't blame Mrs. Hammond. She has had the same lunchbox for every one of these socials. How was I to know it was your lunch? I grinned. I knew you were staying at Doc's, so I took a chance and bid on it. I wouldn't have been too disappointed if it was her lunch either. I paused. Miss Johnson, you've grown up. You are much prettier than I remembered you. Thank you, Mr. Miles. Shall we find a seat by the trees where there is a small table and a bench? Small talk continued while we consumed the lunch, her telling me about her last 2 years. There were 4 pieces of chicken, 2 biscuits, some fried potatoes, cold but delicious, and 2 pieces of berry pie. There was a fire in the center of the grounds that had several coffee pots hung over the coals, and we drank from the tin cups that Mrs. Hammond had packed. Mr. Miles, this has to be said. I think I am aware of everything you have done for me in the last 2 years. I believe that it was you who arranged for me to have some money when I left here after the funeral of my brother. It took me almost a year to figure out that Clara was your sister, and that it was you who arranged for me to become educated enough to be able to teach school. I'd like to thank you for everything. I was concerned now about how she wanted to repay me. Is it me that you are after? I will have some trouble with you if that is what you plan. First, though, tell me why you have done this for me. Miss Johnson, to tell you why, I'll have to go back further than when I shot your brother. All my life, I wanted to be a law officer. I had to kill 3 men in the line of duty before that fateful day. All 3 had to be brought to justice because of things they had done. One was for assaulting a young woman. Another was a bank robber who killed a teller, and the third was a man who ordered a family killed so he could take over their property. All of these men would have been hanged eventually. They just chose to die by my hand instead. There were others that I brought in who gave up when challenged and chose to let a judge and jury deal with them. I was comfortable with the way I was administering the law. When I killed your brother, that all changed. I couldn't be sure I was doing things the way they should be done. I questioned myself, could I have done anything differently? I will tell you this, if your brother had been 3 or 4 years older and I had killed him, I would still be a law officer. This brings me to you. I knew what your future prospects were. You, poor, uneducated, and reasonably attractive. Well, let's say in your circumstances, your future had only one road leading towards something not so nice. I gave up the law the minute I saw your brother lying on the ground. I had a few dollars, so I used them to help you. I think I have succeeded. I have never entertained the idea of you having to pay me back for anything. The law killed your brother, but I pulled the trigger. That precludes any thought of us being any sort of friends. I do appreciate the chance to have this little talk, so I can make my apologies again. I was afraid you might cut me cold when you saw who bid on your lunch. I truly hope you will be a good teacher. If you do, that will be my thanks, knowing I was a part of your success. I will be Mr. Miles. What are you doing now that you aren't a deputy anymore? I have a bit of land about 45 miles from here. Takes about 9 hours to travel there with a good horse. I'm going to be buying some cattle to stock the ranch very shortly. Both the land and the funds to buy the stock would never have come to me if I hadn't given up my deputy's job. In a way, I feel that is thanks for what I have done for you. I do so regret taking your brother's life. To have it happen, Mr. Miles, I think we should put my brother's death behind us and move on. I am grateful for what you have done for me. I thought she might continue in this way because she was silent and pensive for a minute. Then she brightened. The dance is about ready to begin. I can hear the fiddles warming up. Would you ask me for the first dance? I did not have another chance to dance with Lila again and left the dance more than a little disappointed. Schoolteacher Lila was young and attractive and much in demand by all the men at the dance. I had one dance with her, and I guess that was all I was entitled to. The next day, I found a cattle buyer in town and commissioned him to purchase a small herd of short horns for me. I wanted proven bulls to service them. What I needed was a mixed bunch of cows and young stock. I couldn't wait very long for income, so I was looking for yearling steers to fatten up. I took the stage to a town some distance away to have my gold turned into a bank draft. The assay office was supposed to keep information secure from the public, but sometimes the news of gold got out. I didn't particularly want a bunch of prospectors crawling all over my land or nearby. For that matter, that I never heard that there was any significant gold in the area beyond what I had found. So the secret of my discovery was safe. To be honest, I didn't know much about cattle ranching. I was late to start at 30, but I had listened to Dan Walker, the old man who had owned the land before me. I intended to change several things from the way he ran his cattle. One thing he had cautioned was that about 1 in 5 years we had a dry time, and 1 in 7 years there was a severe winter that came down hard on the area. I knew that inevitably I would have to deal with these two things if I continued ranching. I hired a young girl, about 14, who had built up a reputation for finding water with a stick. She identified several places that could be developed into reliable water sources. When fully developed, the water holes would be spread throughout my ranch and should get me through a drought. The snow and cold? I planned to have stacks of hay ready every year. There were crews I hired to come and put it up for me. The cattle might not put on weight during the harsh months, but at least I would have them alive to rebound when the grass greened up in the spring. To have hay, I had to manage my herd so I could grow it. There was a new invention on the market called barbed wire. I traveled and looked at some of it in a hardware store and visited a ranch that had been using it for the last 2 years. It took time and money to do all of this, and I was fast running out of both. I hired an old, broken-down cowboy named Cole, who just wanted a place to live out his life and be able to tell his tall tales about how things used to be. I paid him with board and room and supplied him with whiskey. He was happy with that, and I made sure all his needs were met, including enough money to buy tobacco. He was the one handy person I needed and knew cattle ranching inside and out. He drove the buckboard, delivering posts and wire used to divide my ranch into fields and pastures. He also fed the horses and messed around in the garden spot, growing a few vegetables. The 3BS, beef, beans, and biscuits, you can get tired of them. When I needed to move stock, I hired someone on a weekly basis or swapped labor with another ranch not too far away. In springtime, I had my cattle in the hills, spread out into the various pockets of grass. A few here, a few more there, whatever the graze would bear. My haystacks were all in a row by August, and the fields were ready for fall grazing when I brought the cattle in from the hills late in September. Where the cattle would be wintered, I let the grass cure all summer long for winter feed. The cattle could dig down through the snow and find graze. When the snow was too deep, I fed them from the stacks. The only other full-time help I hired was Nathan, an orphan boy of 17. He had been brought up in the city and had run away, heeding the call to go west. I picked him up off the streets, and he was so thankful he worked his butt off showing his appreciation. He soon earned cowboy wages and tried to emulate me in every way. The world around me was fast changing. Not more than a month after I got my herd, silver was discovered in the hills west of my ranch. Enough so that several mining companies began developing mines there. Although they were 30 miles away, they affected me considerably. A 70-mile spur was constructed from the railhead to the mines. The rails replaced the stage in the town where I had been a deputy years before. 3 acres of my land were bargained for. I made a deal with the railroad that they would stop the train and take on my cattle or stop to take on a passenger if I put up a flag. I constructed a few small loading pens and a chute so the train wasn't held up for long during the loading. When I made the deal, I thought my beef would be heading east to the slaughterhouses. But as the mines developed, most of it was sold to feed the miners. This was a good life, but I was lonely. I went into town occasionally and socialized when there was a dance. Always I would run into Lila, and always I would think about her. Sometimes we danced together. It had been over 2 years since she came home. We still addressed each other formally, and although I would have loved to call her Lila, I didn't know how to go about it. There seemed to always be a barrier between us, in my mind anyway. Many people, friends and acquaintances alike, wondered why she didn't pick someone and get married. Lila just brushed the many comments and the several proposals aside. saying she wasn't going to settle for anything but love. Lila still lived with Doc and Mrs. Hammond, and she was treated like a daughter by them. She, in turn, looked upon them as her parents. It was a year after the railroad spur was laid that Mrs. Hammond and Lila visited my ranch. Mrs. Hammond had been declaring for weeks that she wanted to see where I lived. It was to be a short trip. The train traveled west to the mines and would return east in a few hours. Mrs. Hammond informed me days before when they would be arriving, so I was waiting at the loading pens with the buckboard when the train stopped. The train was a work train carrying or out supplies in and personnel. When Lila started to call me Mr. Miles, as she always had, I said, "Call me Caleb, you are my guest. I'd very much like to call you Lila. Of course, this Mr. Miss thing has gone on way too long." "What beautiful country," Lila remarked as she looked around. "I don't get out of town too often, just on a Sunday for a drive sometimes." That sent a pang of jealousy through me. This was an unconscious statement by Lila, I was sure. Lila just didn't see me as a suitor, and why should she? Mrs. Hammond saw what effect her words had on me, though, and quickly asked about my cattle. I invited the two women into my little stone house for a glass of lemonade I had made. Mrs. Hammond and Lila were impressed with the way I had arranged it and how nice and snug it was. Cole and Nathan ate their meals with me in the house, but they had a room behind the tack room for sleeping in the barn I had built for the horses. Cole came out from the barn to say hello, and Lila asked him if he was from Colby and if that was how he got his name. "Nope," he replied. "But I always intended to go there, and I just might do that someday." This was his standard answer to the question. We had only been at the house for a few minutes when Nathan came sliding into the yard on his bay mare. "Boss, two men have got a steer down and are butchering it. If we hurry, we can catch them before they get out of there. It's over in that pocket where the buttercups are." Mrs. Hammond spoke up. "Go, Caleb. If you don't get back in time for us to catch the train, we will stay overnight and go back to town in the morning." I had my newest work clothes on but didn't take the time to change them. I buckled on my gun and grabbed my Winchester while Nathan caught me a mount and a fresh one for himself. In just a few minutes, I was mounted. I stopped long enough to make an apology. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Hammond, Lila. I'll be back as soon as I can." It was Lila who said, "Be careful." I heard this as I spurred my horse forward. It was 2 miles to where my steer was being butchered. I knew the lay of the land and the point they had to reach to get off my property. I figured I could beat them there. We just made it. They had a wagon with the steer dressed in the back. It was covered with sacking to keep the blowflies off the meat. We were almost up to them before they saw us. I pulled up and sat with my horse sideways, blocking their trail out. "Pull up and get down. I want to know who you are." Instead of doing as I said, the driver flicked his reins and shouted to his team. Pulling a whip from its socket, he lashed the horses, and I had to move or get trampled. I dodged but couldn't fire without hitting the horses. I was hit in the right side by a bullet as I turned to take after the thieves. I realized then there were 3 bandits instead of 2. I heard Nathan fire his gun. The one who shot me was mounted and had been off the trail, higher up where I hadn't seen him. If I hadn't been so intent on stopping the wagon, I might have at least looked the situation over before making my challenge. I knew I'd been hit, and hit hard. I managed to stay in my saddle, but it took all my effort to do so. My handgun had fallen to the ground. I looked for Nathan. He was reloading his pistol. In the distance, I could see the wagon going flat out with the 3rd rustler joining them. Nathan came up to me. "You hit, boss." "Yeah, I think it came in from the back and tore through the soft meat above my hip bone. I'm losing blood pretty bad. Tie me on so I don't fall off, and let's head back to the ranch." Some people might say it was lucky timing to get shot when there were 2 women at the ranch, both with nursing experience. I passed out before they took me off the horse. It was dark when I roused up enough to know I was home and in my bunk. I could hear someone moving around behind the curtain that separated my bunk from the rest of the house. Suddenly, the curtain was pulled back. "You're awake, Caleb. Good. Mrs. Hammond caught the train east, and Doc Hammond will be out in the morning. The sheriff will likely come with him, too. Can't have one of the county's citizens shot and not check it out. You're going to be in a lot of pain until the doctor gets here. He'll have some laudanum with him to help. You shouldn't be alone with 3 men. What will people say?" "Oh, who cares? I'm your nurse, that's all." I was in so much pain I couldn't think straight. Thankfully, I passed out again, and Lila's face wavered before me as I slid into darkness. I woke again during the night. There was a candle beside the bed, and I could see Lila sitting in the only decent chair in my little house. She must have been watching, for she came and leaned over me, holding the candle in one hand. Her other hand went to my brow. "You've got a fever, but that's to be expected. Drink some more water if you can. You've lost a lot of blood. I've been stewing some beef for broth. Doc will be here in another 6 hours. He'll tell me what else you can have. Try to sleep." She put a wet compress on my forehead, which eased me. When she turned it over to the cooler side, I swore I felt her kiss me. I wanted to hold on to that thought, but I was gone again. The next thing I knew, Doc Hammond was working over my wound. "Hey boy, you're going to be lopsided. I had to cut away part of one rib. Here, drink this, it'll ease the pain. It might taste bitter, but you won't mind when the pain goes away. Lila's going to make you drink a lot of water and spoon broth into you. She's a great nurse. Pretty too, in case you haven't noticed." Doc finished with me, then said, "The sheriff wants a word with you before you sleep." "Caleb, what the devil were you thinking? Going in blind like that? I thought you were better than that. Can you tell me anything about the outfit?" Sleepy and in pain, I concentrated hard. Nearly new wagon, smart-looking team with shiny harnesses. The man driving the team had a light gray hat with a snakeskin band on it. I didn't see the one who shot me. Maybe Nathan can tell you. They might be outlaws waiting to hit the mine payroll. "Oh, that's some kid you got working for you." Didn't flinch a bit. "I might take him if I need him. He'll stand good." The sheriff left, and I sank back into sleep. I awoke again the next afternoon. Lila informed me that Doc Hammond had returned to town. The sheriff had left, and Nathan hadn't come back yet. Lila spoon-fed me broth until I hollered, "Enough!" She laughed but stopped. I felt warm, and Lila told me my fever was up, but the doctor had warned her it would be and not to worry. She gave me another dose of the bitter medicine, and I slid back into darkness. The nights were the worst, filled with dreams, more like nightmares. I relived the killing of Lila's brother and the horror I felt knowing I'd taken the life of someone so young. Then the dreams shifted, and I dreamed of Lila. In the dreams, she talked sweetly to me, and we went on Sunday afternoon drives through the country. The dreams always ended with me proposing to her. But each time, she refused, turned away, and faded into the distance. The sequence played over and over. "Caleb, Caleb, you don't want to die." I thought I heard her voice say one night, "I don't want you to die. Listen to me. Get well, and then we'll talk about us. I have a confession to make, but you have to be well to hear it. Please, Caleb, please." Was I asleep or awake? I felt her lips on mine. They weren't soft. This was a woman's kiss, demanding a return. Was there a promise in those lips? I thought there was. I smiled faintly, and the nightmares faded. When I came fully awake, for once out of pain, I could see through the open door that the sun was well up in the sky. I didn't know how many days had passed. I could hear Lila and the sheriff talking outside. She came in a moment later and, seeing me awake, smiled. "The sheriff wants to talk to you. He caught some of the thieves." "Hey, Caleb, how you feeling?" the sheriff asked as he came in. "Better today. How'd you do?" "Great, actually. There were 6 in the gang. We killed 1 and captured 2. One of them is wounded slightly. 3 got away. The one we killed was their leader. He's the man you described with the gray hat and snakeskin band. Guess the gang was hanging around to rob the mine payroll. They got hungry, and that's why they beefed your steer. They tried to hide the wagon tracks, but eventually we followed them right to their camp. If they'd spent their money on supplies instead of stealing, we might not have been suspicious." "Any chance the rest of the gang will come back?" I asked. "Doubt it. Their boss is dead, and the ones that got away only have their mounts and what they could carry. But you should stay alert just in case." The sheriff stood and said, "By the way, the one who shot you is one of the captives. He asked to talk to you. Want to hear him out?" I nodded, curious. The sheriff brought the man in, his hands bound. "Hey, mister, sorry about the gunshot. We was pretty hungry, and I saw you taking it away from us. Glad you're gonna make it. I got a flesh wound, and it smart some. Well, I guess the sheriff will see to it you don't go hungry now. Guess I'm not sorry you're hurting a little either. It's been a tough few days for me." The man gave a rueful smile. "Yeah, I figured you'd feel that way. You got you a pretty woman to look after you, though. Doubt I'll have that kind of luck." The sheriff led him out, and I sat quietly for a moment. Lila came in and handed me a bowl of broth. "Time for your broth," she said with a teasing smile. I groaned. "Can't you put some meat in it? I'm starving." "You'll get there," she replied, amused. "For now, this is all you're getting." After eating, I drifted off again. When I woke later, it was late afternoon. I felt restless and wanted to get up, though I was weak as a newborn calf. The doctor had wrapped me tight, and I doubted moving would do much harm. I managed to swing my feet to the floor, sweat pouring from my forehead. I wrapped myself in a torn sheet, pinned it together, and shuffled outside toward the outhouse. I heard a small cough. "Who's there?" I asked, startled. There was a giggle. "Caleb, I must say you look great in a skirt. White isn't your color, though. Maybe calico next time," Lila teased, trying not to laugh. "I'll have you know this is improvised," I muttered. "I'll help you back," she said, her tone softening. "You shouldn't be out here alone." Her arms around me, she supported me as we made our way back. "Doc left strict orders about what you can and can't do," she scolded gently. "That's the last time I'll wear a skirt," I grumbled. "White or otherwise." The next time I ventured outside, I made sure to wear a poncho that covered me properly. Nathan saw me and couldn't keep his mouth shut. He teased me relentlessly about the skirt incident. I swore that when I met St. Peter, he'd ask me about it, too. Lila and I were usually alone in the house while I recovered. She kept her distance except when I needed support to move around. Despite her distance, I was always aware of her presence. If I couldn't see her, I felt lonely. The memory of that feverish dream about her stayed vivid in my mind. I longed to know if it was hopeless to think of her as more than just the woman whose brother I had killed. 2 weeks later, just before she planned to return to town, I brought up the subject. "Lila, I need to ask you something. Have you ever kissed me? I had a dream where you did. You said some other things, too. Was it all a dream?" Her expression softened. "No, it wasn't a dream," she said quietly. "And yes, I kissed you." She hesitated, then added, "There's a confession I need to make before we go any further." "I'm listening." "This is about the stage robberies where my brother was killed." Her voice cracked, and tears welled in her eyes. "It was I who planned the first 2 holdups. I was there to make sure Isaac did it right. It went so well the first 2 times that Isaac decided he could do it on his own. My brother wasn't too bright, as I told you before. I warned him we couldn't do it again at the same location because the stage line would be ready for us. But he didn't listen." I stared at her, stunned. She continued, her voice trembling. "You trapped and killed him just as I knew someone would if we kept doing it. I hated you for that, even though you were only doing your job. Later, when your sister told me how much you gave up after killing him, I began to understand the guilt you carried. Took time, but I forgave you. And then, over time, I realized—" She looked away, struggling for words. "What did you realize?" I asked, leaning forward. "I realized I didn't hate you anymore," she whispered. "And then, somehow, I realized I loved you." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut, leaving me breathless. I took her hand. "Lila, I thought you'd never forgive me." She smiled faintly. "I did. I forgave you a long time ago." I wanted to say more, but the sound of gunfire shattered the moment. 3 quick shots rang out, coming from behind the barn. Lila's eyes widened in fear. "It's Cole," I said, grabbing my rifle and pushing myself up. "Stay here, and don't come out unless it's safe. If you see anyone outside the windows, shoot." "Caleb, don't go," she pleaded. "You're not fully healed." "I'll be fine," I assured her. "I won't be reckless this time." Before she could stop me, I slipped out through the woodshed. I scanned the area carefully. The first thing I saw was Cole's lifeless body near the barn. My gut twisted, but I forced myself to focus. I spotted one of the rustlers leaning against a tree about 50 yards away, his rifle at the ready. Another sat on a log nearby, looking bored. I lined up my shot through a knothole in the shed. The first man dropped instantly. I swung the shed door open and fired twice at the second man. He slumped over, dead. I scanned the area quickly and spotted the third man running toward the house. Before I could react, I heard shots from inside, Lila's shots. She fired 4 times in quick succession. I hurried around the house, not knowing what to expect. I found the last rustler lying motionless on the ground. Lila had hit him twice, once in the chest and once in the side. He was dead. You okay? I called out. I'm fine, she said, stepping out of the house, her hands trembling slightly. I saw him coming toward the house, so I shot. You did good, I said, impressed. You don't mess around, do you? She gave a shaky laugh. I told you once I wanted to kill you, remember? I had to learn how to shoot, just in case. I smiled at her and shook my head. Well, I'm glad you didn't follow through on that one. We found Cole's body and carried him gently to the barn. Lila sobbed as we laid him on a bed of hay and covered him with a blanket. Nathan returned later that evening, and we told him what had happened. Together, we dug a grave for Cole up on the rise next to old Dan Walker. I figured the two of them could keep each other company, swapping stories about the West. Thanks for watching this tale of love and redemption in Serene Valley. What stood out to you most about Caleb and Lila's journey? Share your thoughts below, and don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more stories.